Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks again, Jen. And thank you all. It's really an honor to be here with you all today, also alongside Jen and my other coworkers and mentors and friends here, Trey and Jeff. I know there's a lot of wisdom here on this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to diving into today's topic, Introduction to Regenerative Organizations, with you all. It's something that I'm really passionate about. I came to this work having spent a little bit of background. So I came to this work having spent a little over 7 years working with international nonprofits and startups, working to solve some of the world's most complex social and environmental issues, and had the opportunity to work on some really incredible teams, from managing international events with a global network focused on the power of utilizing the power of the internet to improve people's lives, to co-creating a digital platform to map and connect the global regenerative agriculture movement, to doing customer development for a vertical farming startup in Montreal, actually, Julie, which really meant selling lettuce and basil to chefs in Montreal, which was really fun. But through all these experiences, I discovered that really what my passion was around helping people, organizations, and networks really become more effective and reach their full potential at solving complex challenges that we're facing in the world. And so having worked with a number of organizations in the field of regenerative agriculture, from Grow Ahead and Regeneration International, I really began to learn about the power of looking to nature as a model, and that there was a lot of potential to do this, take nature as a model within our organizations and get outcomes far greater than we could ever imagine. And so that's really what brought me here. And, you know, for all of us here at Rhythm on the team, we're on a mission to transform how we work together in organizations and networks and communities so that we can all experience abundance and resilience now and into the future. And we're all really deeply passionate about what we do and super excited to be here with you all today. And so with that, we wanted to open it up with a question to really understand, you know, what brought all of you here today, or what brought you here today, and why is this topic meaningful to you? Just take a couple of seconds to reflect on that, and I'd love to hear from you in the chat, or if you're open to it, you can unmute yourself, but I'd love to just hear from a couple of people. So what brought you here today, and why is this topic meaningful to you?
So Julie said, dreadful stagnation in my workplace.
Thanks, Julie. I think that's something a lot of us could probably relate to at some point in our lives, right? Others?
I'll just jump in. You know, there's a lot of buzzwords, you know, sustainability and regeneration. And I think it's a hot topic and people want to know more. But whenever I talk to friends about regenerative organizations, there's still a lot of confusion, and so there's a lot of like what? So
yeah, totally. I see a couple other responses coming in. Retaining employees, curious to see regenerative design applied on the social scale. Awesome, great responses. Well, I'm hoping that this webinar, or Jen and I are hoping that this webinar will begin to provide some more clarity and really start a conversation so that we can all dive in together to exploring this. So thank you all for your responses. And with that, just a couple of things on expectations. So what we're gonna be going through today on the webinar. So we're gonna start with really diving into talking about the state of organizations today. And then we're going to talk about designing with living systems principles. So why would we look to life as a model? We're going to introduce you to Rhythm's regenerative design process and how we approach working with organizations. We're going to lastly share with you Rhythm's regenerative framework, which is a framework that we've developed for designing and managing for complexity within organizations. And then, you know, lastly, at the end, as Jen mentioned, we're going to save some time for discussion, and hopefully my teammates can jump in too. And, you know, throughout, Jen and I would really love for this to be interactive. So we really encourage you to share your reflections and insights and any questions that you have in the chat. But if not, we'll definitely have some time for discussion at the end. So with that, let's dive in with another question. So when you think about what our organizations are designed after, what would you say is the dominant metaphor? So when you think of our companies, our organizations, what typically comes to mind for you? And again, you can type in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself.
Profit, growth, hierarchy. Definitely.
Nice. Yeah.
Military.
Yeah, definitely lots of focus on profit, on growth, on hierarchy. Yep. Results. Absolutely.
Machine.
Somebody gets a gold star. So also before
success. Success.
Yes, nice. Command and control. Awesome. That's great. Well, so when we think about the dominant metaphor, really across all sectors that defines our organizations, it's the machine. And just for a minute, I just wanted to mention why we focus on metaphors and what the power of metaphors are. Metaphors really shape how we think and how we experience the world, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I think these two images are a really great example. We just did a quick Google, and you could see on the left, this is an image from a consulting firm referring to how you can run your organization as a machine. So you can see the various departments from marketing to sales to production that are all different gears in this machine. And then on the right, you see the whole state of Georgia here in the US that's talking about their economic engine, and all the different state departments are parts of the machine. And so in these systems, the focus is really to all of your points on productivity, efficiency, results, command and control, and driving outcomes. And so you're all really spot on with really what those metaphors are. And we even see our human body as machines. So on the left is an image from the early 20th century that compares our body to different parts of a machine. And then on the right are some images that you find, again, just on Google on a quick search, talking about our brains as machines. And I find so much of our personal development work is oriented towards rebooting our brains or rewiring our operating systems, or we talk about how we're hardwired and driven or even burnt out. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've used that expression a lot, but we're talking about ourselves essentially as machines. Mm-hmm. And then here's another example of how prominent the machine metaphor is in business today. This is an Instagram post from a very prominent business leader here in the US. His name is Ray Dalio, and he's a billionaire. He created Bridgewater Associates, which is one of the world's largest hedge funds. And here's what he writes. Think of yourself as a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. So if organizations are machines and we're parts in a machine, what are the consequences of that? Feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. What are the consequences of treating organizations as machines and humans as parts of a machine?
I feel like I need to reboot all the time. Machines break, machines need to be replaced. Coming from Ontario, burnout, mental health issue for sure, and getting worn out, these parts getting worn out. False binary, missing the social component.
Totally, yeah, that's all absolutely right. And if we think about the impacts of this machine metaphor and our machine design on a really meta level, the outcomes of running our organizations as a whole, so everything from government to foundations to for-profit and not-for-profit, it's really having a tremendous impact on the living planet. So we pulled this example. This is just one of many ways to look at the impact that humans are having on the planet. But this is the Living Planet Index, and it shows a 58% decline in species biodiversity on the planet between 1970 and 2012. So, I mean, there's really no question that how we've designed our human organizations is having an impact on the planet. And the machine metaphor hasn't really been great for people either. So every year there's an organization called Gallup that does a study looking at employee engagement. Employee engagement basically means they look at things like how clear you feel about your role, whether you have the opportunity to do what you do best, whether you have strong relationships with your coworkers, and whether you feel really dedicated to the mission of the company. And what they found last year is that 35% of people are engaged at work. 35% of people are engaged at work. That other 65% of people are either disengaged or actively disengaged. 35% is actually the highest number that they've ever recorded since they started tracking the trend in 2000. And apparently it's largely because, according to their research, that it's been a result of changes in how organizations develop their employees, which was really interesting. So while 35% is a great number and it's the highest it's ever been, we still have 65% of people who are disengaged at work. And I think many of us can really relate to feeling disengaged at some point in our careers. That might show up in terms of, you're showing up to work, but you're not bringing your energy or your passion, or you're looking for other jobs. And unfortunately, it's a reality for up to 65% of people, at least in the US alone. So imagine the potential if those 65% of people were engaged. So all to say is the machine metaphor is not, having a great result on people. And it actually also comes at a cost to the US economy. So for instance, in the US, there's estimates that that disengaged employees cost the economy at $450 to $550 billion in lost productivity every year. And then as a millennial, I really wanted to bring up specifically what the engagement rates are for millennials, because I feel like knowing the percentage of millennials in the workforce is around 40% right now, and some estimates indicate that we're going to make up as much as 75% of the workforce in just 5 years. Knowing that, we really need to shift our design because millennials are among the most disengaged or the least engaged at work. So how are we going to change our design in order to accommodate for the next generation of workers coming in to enable optimal engagement rates? And then if we look at it through this other lens, through a lens of equality, as a result of the machine design, individuals have greater net worth than entire countries. So it's a few at the top that benefit, while the people at the bottom are replaceable, and there's just huge inequity in terms of wealth. And another example from a racial and gender equity perspective, this same machine design, the same system is creating a lot of inequity. And race is still the greatest predictor of how well you're going to do with regards to jobs, housing, healthcare, equitable development, particularly here in the US. And then this slide is courtesy of our partner at the Gemini Group. And it really, the point of this slide is to illustrate that the inequities that we've created specifically with regards to race are actually structurally created and designed into our laws of our country. So this just shows that the way that we've designed our laws actually has resulted in tremendous inequity. And this example here just points to key federal laws passed with regards to citizenship and how it truly favored white Caucasian people, especially in the USA. So here at In Rhythm, we see this as a design issue. On the one hand, I know everything I just threw at you could be really disheartening and, thinking that we've designed this way, but it's also really empowering and hopeful because we can design something different and we can choose a different metaphor to design to. Because as we've talked about, what we've done is taken an industrial machine system and we've applied it to a living environment, and it's obviously not serving us, it's not serving the planet, so let's choose something different.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So of course, so of course we see the limitations of designing with the machine metaphor in mind, but we really think it's important to recognize where it came from. Originally, so the machine metaphor was born out of the industrial age. It was originally a very empowering metaphor. And so the metaphor is really characterized by reductionism and cause and effect. And this resulted in the disruption of how we think about fate and divine rights. And so really at the time, there was a dramatic shift occurring in people's minds and in really the world in terms of how people were seeing the world. And it serves as the foundation of Western civilization. And these revolutionary changes in physics from the work that Newton did, they ended up calling it really the age of the scientific revolution. And so it's had a tremendous impact on shaping our world, and it's gotten us to where we did today. But Newton did such a great job at helping to explain the physical laws that govern the universe that we ended up applying everything, applying it to a living environment, to all aspects of human endeavors for the last 300 years. And even Einstein recognized the limitations of this reductionist approach back in the 60s. So he says, when the number of factors coming into play in a phenomenological complex is too large, scientific method in most cases fails. One only need think of the weather, in which case prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible, right? So even Einstein was recognizing that our desire to predict and control wasn't applicable in all cases back in the 60s.
Yeah.
And so the machine metaphor is really rooted in ideas of how we manage various types of problems. So in this table, we see 3 types of problems. On the left, we've got a simple problem. So take, for instance, baking a cake. We have an ingredients list. There's a recipe. We can follow a series of known steps. It's really manageable, and we can repeat it without, we can repeat it. So cause and effect is super linear. Next, well, actually, I'll just add that in this simple problem, in the case of a simple problem, reductionism and prediction and control work really, really well, right? We want to know the steps from start to finish to bake a cake, unless you're, a magical baker who doesn't do ingredients lists, which I'm certainly not. And in the middle, we've got complicated problems. So complicated problems are much like simple problems in that there's a series of known inputs, there's blueprints, there's a series of known steps, and you can repeat it. It's just a little bit more, ziggy-zaggy. There might be it's a little more complicated to get there. So think of, for instance, sending a rocket to the moon. We can predict and get the outcomes that we want, but it's certainly a lot more complicated than baking a cake. And in this case, reductionism and prediction work very well as well. And then lastly, on the right, we are talking about complex problems like ending poverty or climate change or food security, all things that, we're all probably on this call are very passionate about or working towards solving. And in complex problems or in complex systems, there's interdependent inputs. It's quite complex. There's unknown next steps, there's unknown assumptions and unintended consequences oftentimes when we think we have a solution, because the environment is so interdependent on a number of different relationships and factors. The consequences are very difficult to predict and control. And so there's no such thing as really following a set of instructions or best practices in a complex problem. So what we're realizing is that the machine metaphor works really well for simple and complicated systems, which are things that we make. And the machine metaphor is falling short in complex systems, which are really things that we manage. And this requires us to think about a different approach. Okay, so this is a classic example of, just going to tell you a little story about the Macquarie Islands. They're a sub-Antarctic island, and this is a classic example of conservationists trying to apply simple solutions to what was actually a complex problem, and it illustrates really the unintended consequences of trying to take that approach. So I'll tell you a little story here. So the Macquarie Island was discovered in 1810. It's between Australia and Antarctica on a map, and rats and mice were introduced via the ships, right? And as a result of that, people introduced cats in order to control the rodent population so that it wouldn't get into food supplies. And then some 60 years later, rabbits followed because there was a tradition of leaving animals on the island to give shipwrecked people and sailors something to eat. So they introduced rabbits. And then given that rabbits were an easy prey, the cats that were on the island started going after the rabbits. And so the number of cats grew. And then suddenly the island lost a number of its endemic birds because of the cats. And meanwhile, the rabbits were breeding and they were destroying the island's precious vegetation. So you can see on the right, in that image on the right, it's not a thriving environment. The vegetation is suffering. And so by the 70s, there was like 130,000 rabbits that were causing so much damage that conservationists decided to introduce this viral rabbit disease, which made the rabbit population plummet. and then the vegetation began to recover. But what was good for the vegetation was really bad for the wildlife, because with fewer rabbits, the cats were hungry. So the cat came back and they started eating the native birds. And so the conservationists deemed it necessary to shoot the cats. And so there's a lot more to this story, but the point I wanted to illustrate is that the approach kept being this simple solution of, well, let's eradicate rabbits, let's eradicate cats. And they're dealing with a complex issue, but really the approach that they were taking was a simple approach. And so, yeah, this is just a story about how we need to be really cautious about, oops, I changed slides. We need to be really cautious about what approach, what kind of situation or problem we're dealing with, and what approach we take to solve that.
Yeah, can I just interject real quick?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a problem that, well, my husband and I, we both contracted malaria a few years back, and so it was really brought to my attention, you know, what kind of scale this problem is, you know. And you know, a lot of people don't realize, but you know, over 1 million people a year get malaria, and it's such a huge problem. And then we've heard about a solution is there may be a way to get rid of all the mosquitoes in the world, like just get rid of them. And I'm thinking, there are unintended consequences here. This cannot be a good thing. Like, I'm all about trying to eradicate malaria, but let's not get rid of a whole species. And, you know, in turn, there's unintended consequences for sure. So
Exactly. Right?
yeah.
I'm sure we can all think of examples in our work and our lives where we could relate to this. So
Yeah.
Awesome. And so, you know, there's really a growing recognition across a variety of industries, from healthcare to schools, that we need to learn how to manage complexity, and we need to start seeing our organizations as complex systems. And so here at In Rhythm, we really believe that we're in the middle of another shift in perception. So this age, we're not going to be known as the digital age or the Facebook age or the millennial age, to my dismay. Just kidding. We're going to be known as the age of complexity, and we're going to be really defined by whether or not we figured out how to manage the complexity that we're dealing with, issues like climate change, food security, poverty, etc. That's what's going to define this age. And so we need new models in order to understand how complexity works and how to manage for it. And so what can we learn from living systems? Living systems have unique principles, characteristics, and so on that enable them to manage and work with complexity in ways that machine-based systems don't. And so what can we learn? Well, if we're going to turn to life as a metaphor, it's really important to be clear on what we mean by life and living. And there's a lot of definitions out there for what living systems are and what life is, and biology has really disagreed on this for many years. And so what does it truly mean? So here's one example, The Circle of Life. One of my favorite movies growing up was The Lion King. I still listen to the soundtrack occasionally. But really it's based on this idea, this really beautiful idea that the world is balanced and predator-prey relationships live in harmony, and there's meerkats and lions and pumbas dancing in the jungle. But in reality, the model is really more looking at cycles of life. So for instance, when a predator population is really high, this actually reduces the prey population. We kind of talked about that in the Macquarie Island example, right? So life's really more about cycles. This is another way to look at it. And what Disney doesn't want to show is that predation and life can be really, really ugly and sad. And life isn't all unicorns and butterflies and singing meerkats and lions, although we'd like it to be. So certainly the circle of life is not illustrated here. So up until now, as I mentioned, up until now, the field of biology hasn't really agreed on a definition for what life is, which is really surprising. And so again, if we're going to look at life as a model, we need to find something that defines it for us. And what we discovered is a really amazing group of scientists out of Chile who approached this question of what is life from a truly holistic approach. And their names were Humberto Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, whose work has become known as the work that came out of the Santiago School. And so they did a really interesting study. So what they did is they took a cell and recreated it in a test tube. And what they discovered is that they could completely recreate the cell, but it would lack one ability, and that was the ability to maintain itself. So when the cell was operating on its own, all of the pathways were interacting within the cell wall and it could maintain itself. But as soon as it was recreated, it couldn't do that. So it lost its ability to self-maintain or self-regenerate. And so they coined the term autopoiesis, which is a really pretty word. It means self-poetry or self-making. I love that word. And so that was really this big finding of their study, this aha of life's ability to self-maintain is unique. And so this was the definition that they came up with based on their findings. Life is an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So in other words, living equals regenerative and regenerative equals living. So regeneration is truly a defining aspect of what life is on a fundamental level. And so this, for us here at Rhythm, is really core to how we think about how we design and manage organizations. A couple of other unique properties that they found that are really interesting. So they found that, living systems are capable of self-regeneration, like I just mentioned. And they also found that the ability to self-regenerate isn't located in any one place in the cell. It's actually dependent on the relationships in the cell. They also discovered that life is life is an emergent property of all of the parts and the relationships between the parts. And each part is a self-regenerative system or an autopoietic system. So this is an example of if we were to think about the human body as a whole self-regenerating system. So on the left, we have a picture of that as a living human body that's alive because of all the relationships between its different parts. So the heart, the brain, the skeleton, the stomach. We are alive because all of our different organs and aspects of humans, of ourselves, are interacting together, and that's what makes life. Versus on the right, we still have many of those same organs and parts, but and we could keep each of those artificially alive outside of the body, but since they're not interconnected and in relationship, they're not able to be alive and living. All right, and so
I just wanted to interject. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or to respond in the chat. So keep them coming. Keep the comments coming.
Please do. Or even reflections if you'd like. So with this slide, I just wanted to point out that this shift in perception is nothing new. There's been civilizations and cultures really looking to life as a model for many, many years now. And so this is a quote, a book that I'm reading right now is called Braiding Sweetgrass by this amazing author, Dr. Robin Kimmerer. And she looks at the intersection of indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and what you can learn from plants. And she's writing about, she's learning her native language from her ancestors, and what she discovers in the process of learning her language is that the difference between her language and English. So I'll read her quote. Potawatomi does not divide the world into masculine and feminine. Nouns and verbs are both animate and inanimate. Different verb forms, plurals, different everything apply, depending on whether what you are speaking of is alive. So in English, you're either a human or a thing, where we reduce non-human beings to an it, or we must be a he or a she or a they or a them. And it's just interesting to think about how our language, back to this concept of metaphors, can really shape how we view the world, how we speak about the world. And this was all just to point out that this living systems approach is much bigger than any one of us, and many have been thinking this way before us. All right, so many of you are probably wondering, all right, what does this have to do with organizations? How are you using life to design organizations? All right, so just to recap on what we've learned so far. So when you take a machine design, you're engineering best practices, and most of us have been asked to use best practices from other organizations with really the assumption that we can just apply what works in one place into another. This definitely works in machines, but what we found is this ends up enforcing prescriptive structures. Things need to look this way in order for us to operate that way, right? Which actually ends up degenerating the health of the system. And in contrast, if we start with living systems in mind as our metaphor, this foundationally informs the principles that we utilize to design to. A principle-based approach allows for facilitating flexible frameworks. And if we do this, we can keep this self-regenerating aspect alive in our organizations. So in a machine design, it actually takes more energy to manage and requires more external inputs. Whereas in a living systems design, it takes less energy and there's the ability to self-maintain because we are creating the conditions for the organization to maintain itself. And a lot of our work here at In Rhythm is actually recognizing that this is really hard to do, and people, it requires a shift in perspectives and operations. And so a lot of our work is educational like this on webinars. We also offer things like online courses, but we spend a lot of time actually working with and in organizations, helping to shift perspectives and operations in terms of how we design and manage our organizations. And I just wanted to point out also that there's not one approach that's good or bad. Like living systems design isn't good or bad. Machine design isn't good or bad. It's all about how we apply them. So back to that problem slide, you know, the machine design is great for simple and complicated problems, but it's really not so great when we're trying to apply a machine design to a complex system, right? We need a living systems design. So one example we often reference in our webinars is, I certainly wouldn't want to receive a package with my IKEA desk with some living systems principles and flexible frameworks that tell me and my husband how to put together our IKEA desk. I don't think that Griffin and I would have a very good time going through that together. Whereas, you know, I definitely want to know the series of best practices and steps to put together my IKEA furniture. I mean, how many of us has ended up with that one little screw at the end?
That might be a good webinar, good just to have that whole experience on camera.
Oh my gosh, putting together IKEA furniture based on living systems principles.
Yeah, we should try that.
All right, stay tuned, everyone. That'll be next time. All right, so what do we mean by principles? So these are the principles that we have chosen as In Rhythm, informed by living systems to design with. And this is how we design with life in mind. Our principles have been really influenced and inspired by a number of the incredible people that we've worked with over the years, including the Savory Institute and Jens Smuts and his work in Holism, community dynamics, Fritjof Capra's work, who we mentioned earlier, and also Carol Sanford's work. So super grateful for all those who have influenced our work and perception on how we can design with life in mind. And so the first principle that we design with is holism. So this is really just recognizing that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that life is a holistic, emergent property based on the interdependent relationships and parts of a living system. The second is mutualism. So mutualism is about recognizing the inherent value and dependence on the other. And when we design with mutualism in mind, we're recognizing the need for a thriving community of clients and team members and partners in order for abundance and resilience to emerge. And the next one is uniqueness. Uniqueness is really important because every member in a living system is uniquely positioned to contribute and to play a role. And in regenerative organizations, it's really important that we design according to that to enable the greatest energy and the greatest potential possible. The next one is evolutionary. So living systems maintain a dynamic balance with their supporting environment and adapt to constant change, right? So we're constantly adapting and evolving based on the environment around us. And this keeps the ability to be resilient into the future. The fifth is nodal. When you think of nodal, think of a network. So think of, you know, all the different nodes connected in a network and the ability to, sorry, let me have a sip of this, one sec. So we really believe that in organizations, this nodal design, this principle of nodalness is extremely important because a central power structure can actually increase short-term efficiency and effectiveness, but it actually increases the risk of the system, right? So if there's one centralized control, command and control, you actually have very little resiliency because it's so dependent on that one part. But when you've got a nodal design, the network is the basic unit and everybody is playing a role, and it's much more resilient through time. And then lastly is developmental. So we just recognize that creating the conditions for members in an ecosystem to grow and thrive is dependent on their ability to develop and really express their uniqueness. And yeah, I mean, this actually just points back to that Gallup study in terms of this principle showing up in a lot of organizational design is actually enabling organizations to generate even more engagement and release even more potential. So that's really cool to see show up in a study like that. All right, so even Mr. Buckminster Fuller appreciated the power of designing with principles. He was really a multidisciplinary dude. He was an architect, a systems theorist, an author, an inventor, and he was even awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So he was an amazing human being and has influenced our work. And he even recognized, and he said, work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help. Yeah, very powerful. So with living systems principles, we facilitate flexible frameworks. So what on earth do we mean by framework? So this is in Rhythm's regenerative framework. And you could really see this as a design framework, but it can also be utilized as a design process. And I mean, we always like to call out that it's difficult to represent something holistic two-dimensionally. But today, just for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to walk you through briefly about our framework from left to right. So if you look on the left, we have our organizational context. In any living system, we always start with understanding the context. So your purpose is your deep why, it's your compass, your quality of life. We look at not just what are we trying to achieve together, but how do we want our lives to look while we're achieving our purpose. We look at behaviors and what behaviors are needed to achieve this purpose. And we look at what supporting environment is needed to support our behaviors and quality of life. If we look at the next column, we've got health. And I think this is something that's really unique to the work of In Rhythm. We spend a lot of time focusing on understanding the underlying health of the system. In any living system, I mean, if you think about agriculture, for example, we need to create the conditions, we need to create healthy soil in order to be able to grow crops, for instance, in the long term, right? There's, industrial agriculture has been mining our soils for many, many years, and we're beginning to recognize the limitations of that. And we actually need to create the conditions for healthy soil in order to create abundance and resilience and amazing food over the long term. And so similarly, in organizations, we need to focus on creating the conditions for that underlying health. So we look at four main elements. We look at energy flow, are people thriving? Informational cycle, is there intelligent decision-making occurring in the organization? Are everybody decision makers? Communication cycle, how is information cycling? Do people have access to information, to relevant information in order to make intelligent decisions? And then the last component or characteristic of organizational health is network connections. So do we have a diverse community? We recognize that we need that diversity in order to thrive. And then the middle section here is structures. So we spend a lot of time here with organizations. Structures are first and foremost designed to enable the health of your organization. And then secondly, to serve as the platform for doing work. So if you're wondering what a structure is, you can think about things like roles and responsibilities, organizational design, monitoring, and evaluation. Most of the time we tend to design those with work in mind, but when we shift that and really focus on designing that with health in mind, it can make a huge difference. All right, so organizational work. So I think this is the purpose of many organizations come together to do work, right? And when many of us are faced with an issue in our organization, we tend to shift over here to saying, well, let's change our strategy, or let's design a new program, or, oh, Slack will solve all of our problems, or we need an Asana subscription so that we could project manage better. But the reality is that oftentimes those issues are really happening over here, and you could change the work all you want, but it's not going to change the health. And so what we really mean by organizational work is utilizing these three areas here to create the conditions for work to feel like flow for everyone in the organization, to be able to feel like we are all participating in a work environment where we're thriving and that work is super meaningful and life-giving, right? And then lastly, if we can do all of this, we can really create the conditions for abundance and resilience for our organizations to emerge. And we really believe that we don't even know what's possible because we haven't created those conditions yet in most organizations in the world. And there's things that we can't even predict because we're dealing with complex living systems, right? And ultimately the goal is to create more resilient organizations, right?
We had a comment, this is brilliant. And it is.
iPad, I see that iPad says this is brilliant. Thank you, iPad.
Yes. Thank you,
Awesome.
iPad.
So, okay, how does this framework really work? Show me an example of what unlimited potential looks like. All right, so here's an example of our partners at the Savory Institute. A lot of our work has grown out of holistic management. Savory's been approaching their managing land in this regenerative way. This is a photo of some of the work that they've done. And simply by changing a management and design approach with no external inputs, they shifted from that to this, right? So when I look at this image, I think about those 65% of people that are disengaged or actively disengaged at work. And I'm like, wow, look at the potential, right?
Yeah, it's amazing.
All right. So what do we mean by shifts? So like I mentioned, a lot of our work is focused on helping organizations manage through their shifts in perspectives and in operations. And so what do we mean by that? We've discovered 6 key shifts that need to take place. So we start shifting from thinking about parts to wholes, from competition to collaboration, both within and between organizations and in industries. We shift from recipes to responses, no best practices. So we're co-designing for adaptation, resilience, and solutions are really context specific depending on what organization or community you're working with. We shift from prediction to pattern. So we're focused on creating the conditions for health and emergence versus controlling and commanding outcomes. We're shifting from extraction to equity. So people are the energy source, and we're focused on development of the whole versus just the few at the top, for instance. And then we focus on shifting from centralized power to decentralized empowerment, intelligent and resource decision-making. And so here at In Rhythm, our definition for regenerative organizations are a living, evolving, naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. That's our working definition. And I'm gonna leave you, with one question, and then we've got another question. Or this is a quote, sorry. I'm gonna leave you with a quote. So be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given to you because you would not be able to live them. And that's the point. The point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will find them gradually without noticing it and live along some distant day into the answer. And this question or this quote has really been sitting with me since I started within Rhythm, and Trey introduced it to me because, coming into this work, we all have so many questions, what's a regenerative organization? How can I do this? And just encourage you to really live into the questions.